Welcome everyone. Hopefully everyone can hear me and is connected well. Good evening and thank you for joining us tonight for the Freedom Series. We're continuing our series to look at tonight's issue, which is lack of housing for people that are currently incarcerated who are simply being incarcerated right now for their lack of housing options and ability to secure housing. So we're going to go through a few of sort of our technical welcome instructions. So Josh, if you want to go to the next slide. Awesome. So our Zoom tips. So everyone will be on mute while we are in conversation. We did change things a little bit, that during either the slide presentation, which there's only a few slides to get through, you can do the raise your hand, you can use the chat function, and you can also use the audio if appropriate to ask a question during our conversation, because we really want all of you to feel like you're a part of this conversation and getting questions answered as you go and really getting engaged with this topic. So we are recording, just to preemptively say that to everyone. And this recording are for the people that registered but are maybe having to do dinner or stuff with their families or working late, who weren't able to be here live. And also, unfortunately, we do not have the ability to troubleshoot technical issues during the course of the online forum. So those are just some tips to get everybody started. I think we're going to look into the overview. So no place to stay except prison is the title of tonight's online forum. We're going to do just a brief overview of the lack of housing issue, what that term means. We're going to talk about some current housing options and also a breakdown of some statistics of the number of people incarcerated right now for lack of housing. We have a great guest speaker tonight. I'm very excited to welcome Jill Martin. She's an attorney with the Prisoners' Rights Office. There she is waving. And a little bit about Jill. She is a graduate of the University of Michigan and the George Washington University Law School. She previously worked as an attorney in Law Enforcement Bureau of the New York City Commission on Human Rights. And Jill joined the Prisoner Rights Office in March 2016 and focuses on working with incarcerated clients and people on parole on issues of post-conviction relief, prison conditions, discrimination, and medical care. And that is a pretty extensive list, so thank you, Jill, for being with us tonight and taking time out of apparently your very busy schedule to be with us and talk about this issue. Okay, so let's dive in. Josh, just so everybody knows, Josh is our tech person, so if you see him chatting with you or managing things, that's him waving there. He's great and volunteers to help us out with some of our tech stuff, so thank you to Josh ahead of time. Okay, so lack of housing. What does lack of housing mean? And so I'm just going to read this and then talk a little bit about what that looks like in action. So the term lack of housing is a term used to describe someone who is being held in jail or prison. We really only have one system here in Vermont, past their minimum sentence, and who is eligible for release, but is in need of housing that will be accepted by and passed inspection by the Department of Corrections, Probation, and Parole Office. And what that looks like, so as many of you know, and for those of you that don't know me, should have probably done my introduction before this, but I'm Ashley Messier now, formerly Ashley Sawyer. And I'm a consultant here on the Smart Justice Campaign with the ACLU of Vermont, as many of you know, because I recognize many names here. I am also a formerly incarcerated woman in the state of Vermont. So this issue is pretty near and dear to me as I've been through this process, having come out of the facility on supervision, needing an approvable residence. So what that really looks like is when you are approaching your release date, your minimum release date, and you're looking into, where am I going to go? Basically, you know, there's some transitional housing options, there's some sober living options, and there's also, you know, maybe you have a home that you left, maybe one of your loved ones, you know, is willing to let you come stay there. Some people have no options, and we're going to talk about that as well. But really, it becomes, you know, a lot of application processes. If it's a private home or private apartment, the FSU unit, which is the field supervision unit, needs to actually go to the residents, talk to the people, make sure there's no weapons, drugs, alcohol, etc. And that also means sometimes looking into, you know, who else is living there, who the neighbors are, what street is it on. So it gets really complicated because unfortunately there's no exact formula, and there are times that, you know, residences get approved, but there's also times that they get denied for a whole list of reasons. And unfortunately, you know, it really depends on sometimes who the probation officer is, who the FSU team includes. So we'll get into some of that with Jill and talk about how that looks as well. So Josh, next slide. So, you know, I always believe in in transparency and in being just really honest and upfront with everyone. So this is actually from a DOC report that came out. And this is people who are being held right now, lack of housing, and these are their crimes. So just to explain this a little bit, so if it says F/serious, F/person, so that stands for felony, and then the M stand for misdemeanor. So like 04 is, you know, these are felony drug possessions, you know, F for property, these are property crimes, etc. So, you know, things of serious nature and, you know, crimes on a person. So for example, a felony on a person could be something like an aggravated assault or, you know, a domestic assault. So just to give you an idea of what those means, and I did put where this came from, so you're able to access that as well. There's also a quote from this same report that has the exact website link at the bottom. So this is a breakdown of what people have been charged with that right now are facing just having nowhere to go. They're eligible to come out, they're eligible to be in the community, and these are sort of what they've been convicted of currently. There's also another 7 people that aren't represented on this graph, on this little table, that are being held right now, what they call case staff Tenita residents or NOS Tenita residents, which is basically saying that they've decided that on their level of supervision they need an approved residence. So there's actually 134 people, to be really accurate. So this is just the breakdown of percentages and count of offense type of people right now who are dealing with this issue. So Josh, next slide. So in talking about, you know, housing types, you know, places that people can go, this is a pretty comprehensive list. You can see a lot of places on here. But the interesting thing to point out, so these are transitional living houses or programs and also sober living programs. Really, this list is from Chittenden County mostly. And I really want to highlight that because that tends to be our most highly populated area. That, you know, people in Vermont, across Vermont, always say that Chittenden County has the most resources or the most money to provide resources. But if you start looking at this list, you realize that it's very gender specific, but there's also more specific information. So this list was found on the Turning Point website, for example, and you can see here that, for example, you know, some places accept people who are on maintenance medications. As we know, Vermont is dealing with a horrific opiate epidemic. A lot of people who are incarcerated, that's really the underlying issue and cause to subsequent crime that they committed or participated in. So there's sort of these housing options, but then they come with, you know, gender specific, only 1/3 of the house can be on supervision, or only one person in the house can be on, you know, maintenance medications, which is medicated assisted treatment. Some places won't accept anybody on maintenance or on supervision. So there's really a mix in here of, of who can go to these places and who cannot. So I just wanted to give, everyone an example to sort of, we'll take a minute to read through this, and really read the sentences that go along with some of these examples. It really starts to pare down where people can go and who can go there. Okay, Josh, you want to go to the next slide? So this is a quote from the same report that had the table of the breakdown of crimes. And I'm just going to read it to you because this is really impactful and really going to guide our conversation for a couple reasons. So it says, additionally, criminal justice involved individuals face the same barriers, employment, childcare, poverty, as many other Vermonters, with the addition of a criminal history. Vermont has a housing shortage, making affordable housing a major barrier for re-entering individuals. Many of those held for lack of housing have been previously released and returned for violating conditions, new crimes, or loss of housing. And this is the slide where you can get the website information for where this report is for both this slide and the table as well. And this quote, before we get into our conversation with Jill and invite the rest of you into this conversation, really strikes me because, dealing with barriers to employment, childcare, and poverty, as many other Vermonters, is really difficult. And this small little wording about with the addition of a criminal history, I don't think gives an adequate picture to what that collateral consequence list comes with having a criminal history. The things you're blocked from, the just even more difficult, like in my own case, here I am working for the ACLU. However, Big Lots and McDonald's wouldn't hire me because I was considered a high-risk employee. So I don't think that wording really gives an adequate picture to the community or people that may not sort of understand this nuanced language about really what that addition of a criminal history really does for people and sort of the outward damage, that it can create for people. And also, this last sentence about people who have been previously released but returned for violating conditions, new crimes, or loss of housing, that doesn't really speak to how we keep people in this cycle. And really the lack of reentry support we have, the lack of reentry options we have, really getting into, violating conditions. Well, for some people that can mean being late for house dinner or violating a small house rule. New crimes can be things like what we just talked about, poverty and childcare. People have children, so new crimes can be things like an attempted retail theft because you stole some groceries. I mean, this doesn't really give an inadequate picture of sort of what people are facing, trying to, get out of jail, secure housing that's going to be long-term, secure, safe, and really help them be productive and really reintegrate back into the community in the way that we all hope and wish that they can and would. Okay, so we're going to invite Jill into the conversation. Great. So I think Josh is going to unmute you, or you may have to unmute yourself.
Yeah. Okay, I think I'm unmuted.
You are.
Great. So I guess I'll start at the beginning, which is how this process looks when you're incarcerated. So in general, when you're incarcerated, your caseworker and perhaps your probation and parole officer do what's called a case staffing, where they decide based on your offense, your criminal history, any disciplinary violations you've received while incarcerated, basically how long you need to be incarcerated. If they decide you can be released to the community, you're now starting your search for housing. This is made really difficult because, number one, you're doing it from inside a prison, where you don't have the ability to call any friend or family member you so choose and ask, can they take you in? And you're faced with a lot of restrictions on places that you can live. So if given your offense, your family will invite you back into their home, which sometimes happens and a lot of times does not. You have to explain to your family member that, for example, if they're active hunters, they have to get rid of their guns. Or if they're social drinkers, they need to lock up or completely get rid of any alcohol in their home before you can be released to their home. If you want to go live with a friend in a rental apartment, the folks from DOC will call the landlord and make sure that you have permission to be there. If your friend receives any kind of federal assistance, specifically Section 8 vouchers, and you're convicted of a felony, you can't live there. So at every turn, there are more and more restrictions. One of the really frustrating restrictions is if you are if you struggle with homelessness and you've been placed by the state or by the city of Burlington in a hotel, as a lot of people are, especially during the winter, you cannot be released to a hotel. You have to find a residence. So it's a struggle. And I think the numbers from DOC may not fully capture everyone who is trying to find a residence while incarcerated. Once you get out and you find that residence, it's a struggle to keep it. So as Ashley pointed out, a lot of the places that were on that list that she provided have their own set of restrictions. In addition to all the requirements being placed on you by the Department of Corrections, your employer, your counselor, perhaps DCF if they're involved in working through a family situation. You're really forced to obey every last rule. A lot of these places have rules like a curfew, or that you have to attend regular meetings or dinners there. Some residences, especially who work with sex offenders, have restrictions on what movies you can have, what computers you can have, whether you can even have a smartphone in the house. And if you don't comply with those restrictions, depending on the severity of your offense, you generally get kicked out of the house and returned to jail.
Jill, I just want to ask a question.
Sure.
Because I think that we have an amazing group of people listening in tonight and participating. And I think that it would be really helpful if you and I could work through some of the stuff around the sex offender specific issue. Sure. In the sense that, I think that people have a misconception of who ends up on that registry and the really large range of crimes that can qualify you to be on that registry. I think in media and, in journalism and movies, we've really sort of demonized those people and their, and just, I think that we just need to give a more accurate picture of who that group is or can include. And also sort of some conversation around, how effective are these restrictions, or are they really ineffective and make barriers even more worse and don't have a large impact on public safety?
Sure. So there are a wide variety of crimes that can land you on the sex offender registry. Everything from urinating in public to inappropriate sexual contact with a minor, to prostitution or soliciting prostitution. It is a huge variety of offenses. The recidivism rate for that population is actually quite low, but because of various social factors and recent cases in Vermont, the punishment for sex offenders in Vermont are among the harshest. I mean, they're looking at sentences that are akin to those faced by people convicted of murder. They're really no different. And a lot of these crimes carry life maximum sentences. When these folks are eligible to be released, they generally may not reside within X number of feet of a school, church, playground. When DOC investigates those residences, they will go and ask the neighbors who's living with them, whether children, for example, come to visit. What are the ages of those kids? They will physically stand in the apartment that person is trying to rent and say, okay, I can see a school, or the family across the street has kids. And I think this is all, in DOC's intention to protect public safety. But nevertheless, the recidivism rate for this population is really low, and it's just layer upon layer upon layer of restriction that make it really, really hard for them to get out. This is also a population that, probably because of the nature of their crimes, tend not to have a lot of family support. They tend not to have a lot of friends. They're pretty isolated when they get released. And a lot of towns and cities in Vermont have restrictions on where they can live. My office actually just worked with a couple people out in Rutland to strike down a sex offender residence ordinance that the city of Rutland had passed that dramatically limited where people convicted of certain offenses could live. But also, if you think about some of the small towns, for example, in the Northeast Kingdom, the availability of housing there is pretty slim anyway. And if you're coming out of prison without a lot of resources, but you want to go back home, you probably need a place where you can access transportation. You're probably coming out without a lot of money, and there are probably a really limited number of places that you can live. And so when you find a place where you can live, then you're faced with these whole other barrage of restrictions, and they make it incredibly difficult for these folks to come out and return home and regain productive lives.
Thank you for sort of clarifying that, because as I said, I think that I know myself have been told things like, oh, you were a junkie, and oh, you were a criminal, you should spend the rest of your life in jail. I think that, you know what I mean, we have a misconception of, people who commit crimes, and then if you're convicted of a certain crime, we have sort of this instant picture. So thank you for sort of clarifying, some of that for us. So we've talked a little bit about what the process looks like. And so do you have sort of some specific examples you'd like to share about, people you've worked with, things your office has seen that really speak to this issue and sort of how impactful it is, and why it's something that we should really be looking into and really, be focusing some of our efforts on?
Sure. So I'm thinking of two cases come to mind, and they are really at opposite ends of the spectrum. So I have one client I've worked with who was convicted of a nonviolent offense, found housing at a transitional living facility in Burlington, and really was working to get his life back on track. And one of the ways that he did that was he found a great overnight high-paying job. I think he was getting time and a half for the overnight shift, and was all excited to start work, and was told by the housing provider, no, you can't have an overnight shift. We need you here. You have a curfew. So you need to find a job during the day. Well, that was a lower paying job. So, he was trying to save money, was really struggling with life on the outside, and finally moved into a hotel. Great. Was doing really, really well. Sober, working, doing what he needed to do. And for some reason, and I forget the exact circumstances, he was reincarcerated and went before the parole board, I believe, in that circumstance, and said, hey, listen, I've got a plan. I want to go back to my hotel where I have my life. I'm close to transportation. I have a job waiting for me. I would like to do that. And his parole officer said, no, you have to go back into transitional housing with all the restrictions, because we won't approve a hotel for release. And that was incredibly difficult. He could prove that the hotel was his home. He could prove that it was a stable living environment that really matched all of his mental health and behavioral and and all of his needs working to rebuild his life. And yet, due to policy, he wasn't allowed to be released. On the other end of the spectrum, I have a client who's incarcerated due to a sex offense. And he has been trying for 2 years to find a residence. It is an endless struggle. He wants to go to his home community, and either landlords, when they hear what he's done, won't accept him at all. Or if he can find somewhere that will take him, he has to coordinate with a housing assistance program to help pay his rent while he tries to find a job. They have to talk to all the neighbors in the building. And by the time they start to figure all that out, the housing has fallen through. And so this man now has been incarcerated for 2.5 years while he's been waiting to find a house.
So we've sort of talked about opposite ends of the spectrum, and I think a lot of people fall somewhere in the middle, to either one side of that or the other, unfortunately. And so what do you think are some possible policy changes or solutions? Sort of what are some ideas that you have, having done this for quite a while now, and you have a pretty extensive background in issues, dealing with surrounding things. What do you really think is, some solution-based stuff we can start to talk about and look at?
Sure. So, I think on the whole, one of the ways to fix this is to increase affordable housing in our communities so that when people are reentering, they have more than one option to come back to, that they can do something more than just transitional housing. I also think that, DOC needs to change some of its policies, but truly the only way this will get done is if people who, care for those who are incarcerated or are passionate about these issues speak to their legislators and take a voice in these issues and say, listen, we would rather have people under supervision at home where they can actually become a functioning member of society while they're serving their time rather than have them incarcerated. In the alternative, if people want to buy rental buildings and rent them to people under supervision, that's great too. But that's not, necessarily a likely solution.
Interesting. So, one thing that's sort of been talked about in the past, and I'm curious, to bring this up in conversation, and this is something that actually one of our listeners just sent me, is, Vermont is one of very few states that even have the FSU system. Most states do probation or parole, and don't do this middle section of supervision. Sort of, what are your thoughts about how Vermont should navigate that? Should we sort of join in with the other states, and what would the impact of that be on this issue?
Sure. So for those who aren't aware, let me just give a brief primer on furlough versus parole. So furlough, I commonly refer to as parole plus. It is a way to release people from prisons and jail under a higher degree of supervision to the community, and then generally after about 3 months on furlough, with the positive recommendation of your PO, get granted parole. There are more restrictions placed on you while you're on furlough than when you're on parole. And most importantly, when you're alleged to have violated the conditions of your furlough, you are immediately returned to jail and given what's called a notice of suspension hearing, at which you are not entitled to counsel. And if you are found that you violated the conditions of your furlough, you remain incarcerated until you can be case staffed again, meaning that your PO and your caseworker at the prison come up with a plan, and that may be to find another residence, or that may be to serve a sanction, meaning that you're stuck in jail for a while, or that may be to max out your sentence. In contrast, if you're on parole and you are alleged to have violated the conditions of your parole, you're entitled to counsel. Someone from my office will go with you in front of the parole board and will represent you and will fight to keep you on parole. And that's a really important distinction. I think the advantages to furlough really serve some people, but I think most of those can be addressed by a slightly different parole system. So furlough is looked at as having this higher degree of supervision, which is better suited to some, high risk offenders. And it's a way to, kind of test how people are going to do in the community. But I think if we just had parole, where you're given a lot more due process protections, and someone who's not DOC, this parole board, who in theory at least is a third party body who will listen to your side as well as your caseworker's side to decide whether to give you parole. Parole could develop a high risk program that could offer the same level of supervision as parole, but without those extra restraints.
Yeah, and I just want to add too that having been on FSU and parole myself, it is possible to sort of build in, so like the curfew option, the approvable housing option, those are actually restrictions they can decide to build into your parole.
Mm-hmm.
So the reality is there isn't a lot, that the parole system couldn't do, but it does get rid of things like people being reincarcerated for, say, missing those meetings or dinners at the transitional living house, or, being
Right.
late for something, because that's what we're returning people to prison for. So, we have approximately 1,700 inmates right now in the Vermont correction system. However, we have thousands more that cycle through under the probation and parole offices and sort of through the system each year. And those are approximate numbers. I don't know exactly how many thousands of Vermonters cycle through our system each year, but that information is also built into some of the DOC reports. So I think that it looks like we have a question. So
yes, there's a question from Kay Hamilton asking from the previous section, what specific asks do you recommend we make? I'm also curious if there's any national movement to amend Section 8 restrictions.
So would you like me to go ahead and answer this one, Ashley, or at least try to?
If you want to start, sure. And if I have anything to add, as I usually do, I will. I'll follow up.
So in terms of specific asks, I assume that you're referring to the legislature.
Yes.
So I guess I would start with pay attention to the bills that are being passed and to the discussions that are being had, and voice your opinion. Without looking at the legislative calendar, I can't think of any really housing specific bills that are coming before the legislature. That being said, there's a House Committee on Corrections that frequently meets, and they often, ask the DOC for specifics and what is happening with all of these different programs. And I would assume, just based on the link that Ashley had, given that, these are Monica Weber's reports, and she is someone at DOC who works often in the legislature, that these reports were prepared in response to a legislative inquiry. So, I think the first thing you can do is ask, and this, ask what's happening. And the second thing you can do is say, legislators, how do we put the focus on bringing people home? And as a citizen, that's what I would like. And so can we amend some of the restrictions? Can we look at maybe putting more of a legislative voice into DOC policy, developing rulemaking around what is and is not an okay residence, things like that. In terms of the national movement to amend Section 8, there are no specific movements that I'm aware of, but I can tell you that there are lots of campaigns out there to get Section 8 coverage for people convicted of felonies. It's not unique to Vermont, and I'm sure if you Google it, there will be lots of stuff out there, because it's a problem that is felt nationwide.
Yeah, and just to add to that, as I said, I probably would. The Section 8 guideline comes from the HUD department, which is the federal department that's the what is it, Housing and Urban
Housing
Development.
and Urban Development.
There we go. There's a lot of acronyms in my life. That's sort of a national thing that everyone is dealing with across the nation, and that's sort of a uniform rule. They also have some subsequent rules, things like if you were on Section 8, for example, living in an apartment and you got charged with a crime, you can lose your housing. They have 3-year penalties, which means if something happens and you lose your Section 8, you serve, a 3-year penalty where you cannot get any assistance. So, there's also more collateral damage in that system as well. So, that's a good question and something definitely to look into. I agree. Legislatively, coming into 2019, we're in a new biennium, which is nice. And it's, there's sort of multiple ways to engage with your legislatures, right? We're lucky enough to live in, well, semi-white Vermont today anyway, that we, white outside, I mean, with the snow. But just to clarify, but they're the people we go to the grocery store with, and they're the regular people that live down the street from us or that we went to high school with. Those are the people that serve right now in our government. We have access to them. So it's not only looking at sort of what bills are already introduced, but these people have the options to introduce bills themselves. And if a legislator hears, wow, there's 10 of my constituents that really want me to do some work around, some of these issues happening in the criminal legal system here in Vermont, they're liable to act on that, because 10 people calling them, asking to meet for coffee, sending them some emails and engaging in this conversation, that's pretty impactful to them. So I think that, it's not only looking at what bills are already out there, but also engaging in conversation, with your elected officials. It's also about, talking to them. If you don't see, a bill being introduced about the issues that are really important to you and that surround, the issues that really mean something to you, they can introduce them, they can write them. So, there are many options on how to engage with your, elected officials in that way. We got to thank you. That's a really good point of being proactive. Well, you're very welcome, and we're really glad that you guys are engaging with us. And Jill, how do you feel about sort of unmuting our participants and engaging with them?
Not to call her out, but one of our participants is a legal fellow at Legal Aid here in Vermont, who actually focuses on some housing issue involving mental health. So I see that she's on here as well. She might have some interesting things to add.
Well, that would be great. Josh, do you want to unmute the group?
I'm sorry to call you out.
Well, you didn't call her out by name, because I'm still wondering who this.
I was trying to be really nice about it, but she can call herself out.
Jill. Let's see.
She doesn't have a microphone. Okay.
Oh, she might. She's Jill. Now you're unmuted. Let's see if you can go ahead. Might not actually have a microphone.
Well, she's talking to us in chat, and so I think everybody can read the chat box, right, Josh?
Correct.
Oh, she says she can call in, smiley face. That'd be great. So while we wait for the other Jill to call in, does anybody have any questions, things they'd like us to answer or talk about or speak to?
So one of the issues that I haven't touched upon yet, but I think is pretty important as we talk about folks who are being held for lack of residence, is people who have pretty significant mental health challenges that makes finding a residence that much more difficult. So as I'm sure will be surprising to no one attending this webinar, criminal justice involvement and mental health often go hand in hand. And the availability of mental health and treatment beds in Vermont are just really, really few. So at this point, it's next to impossible to be admitted to the Vermont State Hospital without an order. All of the psychiatric facilities generally require, emergency admits from the court or from the hospital. So if you're someone who struggles with mental health issues and you need what I would call a structured living environment or a long-term treatment environment, the number of beds available in Vermont is really, really few. And if you have the resources to go out of state, you're limited by your conditions of supervision, meaning by your PO, if you're on furlough or parole, as to where you can go. So we see a lot of times these people are just sitting in prison and in jail because there's no mental health facility that can accommodate their needs. And a lot of times, based on maybe their perceived erratic behavior or some instability, people might not want them as their tenant, and it's incredibly difficult for those folks as well. I think next to sex offenders, they're right up there with the people who struggle to find a house to be released to.
We have a question from Robert in the chat, and Jill has connected via telephone when you're ready.
And I also have a question that came in through my cell phone.
So what correctional facility has the most persons being held? Northern and Southern are the biggest facilities. Those are in Newport and Springfield, respectively. The greatest number of people waiting for release for housing, I don't have those statistics. Anecdotally, I would think Northeastern Regional Correctional Facility in St. Johnsbury, Chittenden in South Burlington, and possibly the Supplemental Housing Facility, which is now in Northwest Mississippi. But Ashley, I don't know if you found that in Monica Weaver's report.
So it's not broken down by facility. However, I think that it's actually can be really a fluid number. So I think that there's times that, Northwest may have more. I think Springfield may have more. I think that number's a little bit fluid, but I think that that's also because of, like you said, the movement around, our out-of-state contract and how that works. I think that, it gets difficult because people who are currently out of state right now who are approaching release are, supposed to be shipped back, 3 months, I believe, in order to plan for reentry and look for housing. And as you know, even as a regular person in Vermont, we have a housing shortage, let alone someone in a facility, trying to plan for that. So that gets really difficult. But I don't think in that report, from what I've read, and I've read pretty much all of it, there isn't a breakdown of by correctional facility, but that's a great question. And I think that if that's information you'd really like to know, I think Monica is easy to find, as most people that work for the government. So you could always shoot her an email and ask your question. I think that's totally legitimate for you to ask. I do want to just answer. Okay, I want to look at this question, but so the one I got on my phone is referring back to our conversation about Vermont being one of the only states that has FSU. It says, what would be the real impact for the better or for the worse of, say, getting away from the FSU system like other states with regards to housing? For me, I think that I can see some clear things, because when you're in the parole system versus the furlough system or FSU system, there aren't as many technical things to be reincarcerated for. Also, there's a whole list of, say, violations of parole where you need to have a hearing first. or even if they do return you to the facility before you're able to see the parole board, they have to do it within 21 days. There's sort of a lot more protections, and your right to counsel, as Jill pointed out. But it's not so sort of arbitrary as, FSU saying, you were late for dinner or you were late for curfew for 5 minutes, you're going back to jail right now, and taking you literally, in that moment. Jill, what are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, so I would say in terms of housing, being on parole versus furlough might not make that much of a difference, but it's more what happens when you lose your housing or your housing changes, that where the impact would really come in. So in general, you are not arrested for a violation of your parole or an alleged violation of your parole. Unless you've been arrested for a new crime, or you've gone on escape. You're generally allowed to remain out in the community until you have that parole violation hearing. And as I said before, you're entitled to counsel. And that's huge. That means you have someone who's there to advise you of the legal consequences of what you're saying, to help you prepare your defense, investigate your case. And that's really important. You're not going in there by yourself. And if your housing changes, or what you require in a living environment changes, it's really helpful to have someone by your side.
Yeah, and that's a really good point, as not all of us are legal scholars or, attorneys ourselves, and navigating, as someone who has navigated the criminal legal system here in Vermont, both the FSU and parole, forms of supervision, it can be really difficult and really intimidating, and a lot of it you don't understand if you've never been exposed to it before. So it's sort of like, if you're a regular citizen and something happens, you get to have a lawyer to help you through that process, which makes a big difference between not sort of being, having that opportunity to have that sort of counselor, someone, to sort of talk to.
Right, and I would also just add that your parole conditions have to be somewhat tailored to your offense and to the circumstances surrounding your offense. So for example, if you're under supervision for simple assault and you committed this assault while you were totally sober and you have no history of alcohol abuse, you can't legally have a parole condition that says you can't drink. That could be legally challenged. And so when you're on parole, though I'm sure you could challenge it if you were on furlough, having that assigned right to counsel, could really make a difference.
Yeah, and just real quick before we move on, I think the clarifying sentence was, would it make a difference in housing upon release? So from your initial release, I don't necessarily think so either, at least here in Vermont. I think in other states that have very different systems, it could, but I think in Vermont, it wouldn't make a huge difference. What are your thoughts, just real quick before we move on to this next
I would
question?
agree with that 100%. It's not going to make a difference probably for your landlord. It's not going to make a difference to your PO, and it's not going to make a difference for Section 8.
Exactly. Okay, so this one looks like, I know that in some prisons, prisoners have to pay for telephone use. Is that true in Vermont as well? I also imagine computer internet use is restricted or non-existent. Do folks know of resources to help people look for housing while incarcerated? Well, so as someone who's been incarcerated here in Vermont, there's absolutely no internet use. And yes, we have to pay for phone calls out of our own money. When you meet with your caseworker, which is unfortunately not that often, they have a very small list, and they sort of hand you a bunch of applications and send you back to your unit to fill them out. But if for some reason you need something other than the applications they gave you, it's really on you to sort of get some outside help from, your friends and family, which if you don't have that, makes it near impossible to get some of this accomplished. And it's just really difficult, because then you sort of fill out your applications, but you have to wait to meet with your caseworker again at some point, when they have availability, and wait for them to be submitted. And it could be a very long, difficult process if you don't have any help or any other help. And then if you are someone who doesn't have any money, or wasn't able to get a facility job, which pay basically 25 cents an hour, and phone calls equal that or more. They actually equal more than that. It can be very costly to try to make, some of these calls even to your friends and family, who then have to call, housing places or financial institutions or, apartments. It's a burden for the loved ones of people who are incarcerated. Jill, what's your experience with that?
Yeah, so you're really dependent on the facility caseworker is the truth of it. If you can't go home, if you can't go to the place where you were living before, you're really reliant on that caseworker. And more likely than not, that caseworker is going to point you to some of these structured transitional housing facilities. Thankfully, some of them are great. Some of them are not as great, but, they're a good jumping off point for people to find more permanent housing, but you are really relying on that caseworker. In terms of, computer and internet use, some people have access to, now it's not JPEG, now it's GTL. So you can send these monitored emails, which are very expensive.
And only to people that are approved, and you can't request someone. So for example, I couldn't send you an email saying, Jill, I'd like to be able to email you. You would have had to go on the GTL site, add me as an inmate, wait for, them to approve it. And that's so when we say it's limited email contact, I mean, it's extremely limited.
Right. And what makes this search for housing also difficult, I would just point out, is that most people are also searching for jobs when they're recently released, not just housing. And it is really tough to get an apartment without a budget and without having any idea whether you're going to be able to find a job and how many hours you're going to be able to get. So you're reliant not only on your caseworker to help you find an apartment, but also to help coordinate housing assistance if you need it.
Exactly. Now, I think that Josh said Jill had called in.
Jill, I've unmuted your line.
Jill, are you there? Oh, no. Well, she was there.
Yeah, so I'm happy to speak a little bit about what Jill's working on, and if she appears magically, she can chime in. So Vermont Legal Aid, through the Vermont Bar Association, has a 2-year poverty law fellowship. And Jill is their new poverty law fellow. I think she started in September. So she's got a pretty huge task in front of her, looking at mental health treatment in Vermont, which is a huge issue. And among her target population are people who are incarcerated. So she sat down with my office a couple weeks ago. I believe she's meeting with all different community members and stakeholders and government agencies to try and get an idea of exactly what the problems are and how she can try and fix them.
That is a giant undertaking, so
yes.
Yay to her.
Yes.
So in talking about, housing options, I think I agree that phone calls are very expensive and should be free. I'm just reading this comment here in our chat. So I think that, it's interesting, to talk about sort of what it actually looks like. So I just want to explain to people when we're talking about these restrictions, because I'm getting some feedback around some clarity about that. So let me just give you an example of a life, a day in the life of someone that's sort of facing this issue, okay? And we'll see if our wonderfully smart, thoughtful participants could accomplish all this as well. So let's say you actually find housing, and let's say you go to a transitional living place. And as we've talked about, your first option is, well, I need to pay for it, okay? So you're out there looking for a job. But at this transitional living house, you cannot leave the house before 6 a.m. in the morning, and you have to be home by 9 o'clock at night. So that is your curfew from the Department of Corrections. Inside of those hours, you actually have to be home at 6 p.m. for, say, house dinner and house meeting. So now you have between the hours of 6 a.m. and 6 p.m. to find a job. Well, as we know, working the day shift, especially when you have a criminal record, that can be even more difficult, right? Working in sort of that 9 to 5 setting. But you also don't have a vehicle because you just got out of prison. So now you're relying on the public bus system or rides from friends and family. And bus trips can take an hour, hour and a half, depending on where you're going and who you're, which buses you have to transfer to, et cetera. So there's the next piece. So now you're down to only a few hours you can work, right? Because you have to wait for the bus starting at 6 a.m. Your probation officer also wants you to meet with him once a week. So let's say you happen to be one of the lucky few that even find a job 7 to 3 during the day. Well, now you have to take off those couple hours to take the bus to your probation officer's office to meet with him for an hour and then back. Oh, and then he also decides that he wants you to participate in counseling and risk reduction, which risk reduction is the Department of Corrections intensive programming model that meets 3 days, what is it, 3 days a week, Jill? And I think it's for 2 hours, 3 days a week for 2 hours in the morning. So instead of going to work at 7 o'clock, you're going to risk reduction from 8 to 10 and then having to take the bus. So by that point, you've pretty much only got 2 hours in the day that you can actually be at work. So, this is really the reality of, what people are facing. I, as a normal person, now that's an impossible task. And then if you add in there, if you have children that you're trying to have visits with or reconnect with, if you're trying to, do any sort of education stuff, if you live in a place that doesn't transit, as a lot of parts of Vermont are very rural, this is an impossible task for even the best of people to navigate, let alone someone who's probably dealing with other barriers, whether it be, addiction or mental health or, dysfunctional family stuff, coming from a life of trauma or abuse, and trying to also navigate, those pieces.
I would also point out that by, let's say, doing risk reduction programming, and if you have to go to the clinic to get your Suboxone, if you're in recovery and you're, trying to find a job, you're also going to be with the very same people you were in corrections with. And a lot of my clients, when they are released, really want to put as much distance as possible between themselves and the people that they were incarcerated with, because sometimes they just don't like them, and sometimes they know that those people have the potential to lead them back on the path to risky behavior, whether it's using drugs, whether it's engaging in other, illegal behaviors. They just want to stay apart from them, but they're being forced back with them every day and away from this kind of productive life of employment, family engagement, education. Ideally, there is some hope. If you graduate from these transitional housing places, you're able to find a job, you're able to move into your own apartment because now you're out, you've got an income, you can make an okay life for yourself. If you've done risk reduction, you don't need to do that. You can have less frequent visits with your parole officer. It's still tough, but it's doable. It's just that initial release phase, which is so incredibly difficult. And it's made even more difficult if you experience any kind of complication in those first few months and you're reincarcerated, and then you're forced to do it all again and again and again. And for many people, the only solution is just to max out their sentence, to try and get some credit, whether, through working or something like that, and just try and get it done so that they can move on and have a life with fewer restrictions.
And I'd imagine not only so difficult, but so critical to setting them up for success. We have, Jill has dialed back in from her cell phone this time, so I will unmute her and go ahead, Jill.
Hi, can everyone hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Yes.
Oh, success.
Yeah.
thanks very much. Thanks, Josh, for troubleshooting that with me, and thanks so much, Jill and Monica, for giving me a shout out and bearing with me while I log in. Yeah, it's super cool. Thanks for organizing this call. This has been super informative, and it's great to connect. I don't know who else is on the call, but it's cool to feel a little bit linked in with the community that's plugging in tonight. As Jill explained, I'll be looking at issues relating to mental health and housing over the next 2 years. And part of that work is consulting, as I did with Prisoners' Rights Office. Part of it will be taking a variety of cases here at Vermont Legal Aid that have kind of mental health and housing at play in different forms. And, the other half of my work, when I'm focusing on consultations, I'd like to connect with people at every level, people who have, are in the system or going through the system, people who are working on these issues or working with folks working on these issues. So I might take advantage of the chat. And if folks don't mind, I'm going to drop my email just in the chat. And if anyone is thinking about this stuff, the mental health and housing intersection in Vermont, has any thoughts, I would love to chat. So I'll drop that in. Look forward to working with all of you over the next 2 years.
Well, Jill, thank you very much for joining in on the call. Sounds like you're excited to take a lot of this on. And I'm curious if you have any thoughts about sort of this intersection between, this inability to find housing for people that are incarcerated who also are suffering from sort of mental health stuff. And if you've, in your early undertaking of this, if anything's really struck you that you'd like to point out.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I think something I've been looking at, Vermont Legal Aid, we have a mental health law project that serves as counsel for folks who are facing involuntary confinement in the civil system and the hospital system, due to mental health concerns. And something I've been looking at here with my colleagues is how the criminal legal system is becoming like an entry point. So folks, there's like this interplay where folks might have charges or an adjudication, and then there's this high risk that folks are then going to become involuntarily confined in the hospital system. And so that is something that's kind of jumping out that I'm looking into more. Generally if we're talking about mental health, rather than people, if we're promoting mental health, involuntary treatment, many experts believe, is not the answer. And so what are some, one of the questions I ever, how is the community mental health system working? How can the community mental health system be supported to better serve folks in reentry, to make that successful and possible? I mean, when we talk about the logistics of a housing search, that's just staggering to me when you're talking about all of these barriers. For someone, just the logistics of calling around or researching. And then if you add to that, complicated issues of folks who would seek certain environments to promote their mental health and well-being, especially where mental health concerns might have been underlying the conviction in the first place. How do we put all those pieces together so that they're working well? It's as you said, it's a daunting set of issues to look at as a new attorney. But I'm kind of talking to folks at different levels of that system to try and see where the gaps are and what might have potential legal solutions.
Yeah, I definitely agree with some of the things that are striking you. And one comment you just made, I think is really important to highlight, and that's sort of the idea of mental health as an underlying cause to how people, get engaged with the criminal legal system, and how that just sort of causes this almost like underlying course of barriers for them. So they, mental health, whether it's, victims of abuse or trauma, addiction-based stuff, which, we know a lot of addicts engage in drug use to cover up sort of mental health stuff or have co-occurring things happening for them. And then, their involvement with the legal system. And then once they sort of get through that system, it's like, it's also a barrier of getting out of it too. So it's like, it's the barrier that can set up their engagement and their interaction with the criminal legal system. And it's also something that prevents them from getting out of it a lot of times in healthy, successful ways. So that's a really good point.
Yeah, and Jill, jump in, because I'm really drawing from the conversation I have with you and your colleagues at the Prisoners' Rights Office. But it was interesting learning. Not interesting, also really frightening and troubling. Learning about the lack of, in many cases, of adequate and accessible mental health care for folks who are in DOC, and then folks might have become eligible for release. But for probation and parole is like, oh, we want to see that you're feeling more stable in a mental health capacity, but that person has not been provided access to adequate care that would really promote mental health. And so, like you're saying, there might be mental health issues that underlie contact with the legal system to begin with, and then someone is being incarcerated, is not receiving access to treatment that they need, and then eligible for reentry, but because of concerns from probation and parole around mental health stability, not being released at that point. So yeah, that kind of cycle or that trap is extremely troubling and something I want to spend time on.
That's awesome, Jill. Thank you. And so I just want to check in with the rest of our participants. It's about 10 after 7. I want to sort of make a last call for any questions or comments that any participants may have, anything we can sort of close the loop on for you. I'm thinking, Jill, if that's okay with you, we may end a few minutes early. If no one has sort of anything else they need answered or want to know more about from us. So does anyone have anything else? I don't see anything. Josh, do you see anything?
No, nothing else.
Okay, great. So Jill, we usually do an ending slide with ways that people can sort of our what you can do slide and how you can sort of stay involved. We touched on some of it already. But I know there's a couple things you wanted to mention around this issue. So if you'd like to go ahead and close with that, and we can have Josh sort of put up the last slide.
Sure. So the first isn't necessarily limited to housing, but I think it's important, and that is to engage with people who are incarcerated in your community, period. Vermont has small correctional facilities scattered throughout the state. They are always in need of volunteers, and I think to go in and volunteer your time and your energy with people who are incarcerated makes their reentry that much easier. And it makes your ability to assist them when they're released that much better, because they're people to you when they're released. They're not just kind of this nameless, faceless group of people who serve time and you don't know who they are or what they did. So that's the first thing. And the Department of Corrections does use a COSA program, which also, if you have the time and can volunteer, it's a great way to help people who are recently released. COSA stands for Circles of Accountability and Support, or Support and Accountability. And it's a way to work with people who are recently released over the course of a year. It requires a donation of your time once a week, but could really make a difference to bringing someone home. I would also, as I said before, encourage you to talk to your legislators and to stay up on the news. If you have questions about policies, about enforcement of those policies, call the Department of Corrections, or you're welcome to call my office and ask what's happening. The more informed you are, the more you can do to help.
Absolutely, Jill. Well, again, I want to say thank you for joining this call. You are an amazing guest speaker, and I appreciate your infinite wealth of knowledge on
Thank
this
you.
issue. And from someone that was formerly incarcerated, thank you on behalf of the people that are still incarcerated, who need the help, and those you're trying to reach who are behind the walls. So thank you for that as well.
Thank you.
On the ACLU end, what you can do, and as Jill mentioned, your elected officials' positions on criminal justice reform measures going into 2019 as we come back with a new legislative session on January 2nd, 2019. Also, you can check out our website at acluvermont.org, Smart Justice Vermont. And also, as we've talked about, supporting bills for reform measures, racial justice, and the improvement of social services and social justice. So thank you, everyone. I hope you all stay safe and stay warm tonight. And thank you, everyone who joined us tonight. Have a wonderful evening.
Thank you.
And I'm pausing the recording.